the size of your buyer pool. If someone says 25 to 50, well, that's fine. But if somebody says, I can reach out to easily 2,500, potential buyers. As a firm, we have a very deep database. We spend a lot of time doing research on who these buyers are. We've been in the space for a long time, so we know most of the operators in the space. And I think, unfortunately, many just don't have that knowledge base to be able to do that.
I am so excited for today's episode. Before we get to that, we have our Ask Ken segment. And the question that came in this week is, what's the fastest way to know if my DSO is overstaffed? This is a great question. Generally speaking, you want to look at this as a percentage of the revenue that your practice is generating. And if you're seeing, and by staff cost, these are dental assistants, front office people. This does not have anything to do with the doctors or the hygienists or anything like that. You want to make sure that you're not crossing the 30% of your revenue, and preferably you want to try to even be closer to 25%. In this market, that's not always feasible or possible, but to the degree you could even get it to 25%, you'd know that you've got a very efficient structure. And you're going to be overstaffed again if you're breaking through 30%. That's where you're going to start to get into an overstaffed position. All right, I am very, very excited to introduce our guest today. And our guest today is Maria Melone. Maria, if you'd take a minute, introduce yourself and what got you into this crazy world that we call dentistry. And if you could then share with us what your dental truth is that you want to talk about, we'll just go from there.
Great to be here. Always good to see you, Ken. In 1995, I graduated with my master's degree in accounting, and I went into public accounting with KPMG. Here in their Boston office, I was assigned to their healthcare and science division. And so most of my clients were large hospitals. However, I had two publicly traded clients. One was a medical device manufacturer, and the other a company called American Dental Partners. American Dental Partners was how I got introduced to the dental space. At the time, they were one of the first consolidators of dental group practices all over the country. And so got to know them through, my role at KPMG with quarterly and annual audits. They happened to be a publicly traded company. So there was a lot of compliance in that regard. And they ultimately offered me a position in their corporate development team. And so I joined with them and spent a total of 10 years on the buy side of dental acquisitions. I did about 100 transactions with them, pretty big range in size. We did a patient record acquisition for, say, $50,000. Our largest acquisition was over $90 million, a multi-location, multidisciplinary group practice. And then, part of that, not only was I doing the acquisitions, but because I was, living inside of the company, because the decisions that I made relative to acquisitions we made and the prices that we paid for them, I really got to know operations pretty well. And I think that's a very unique perspective that I bring to the table, having now moved, primarily over to sell side. So in 2012, I decided to leave American Dental Partners. I started my own firm. I had some silent partners whose accounting business was largely focused on supporting dentists. And so we had, a natural, symbiosis between services they were providing and what I was going to be offering their client base. And then decided to close that firm, and I joined with Hill Advisors. I've been here now for nearing 5 years. Probably the best decision I've ever made. I love where I am. I think we have a wonderful team, and just happy to be here and have a chance to talk with you today.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, so our guests show up with stuff that needs to be talked about that isn't talked about very much. So why don't you tell us what you're here to talk about, and we'll start to unpack it.
Sure. I think what I'm going to focus on is just the role that I play as an advisor, a transaction advisor. Where I'll start with that is, when I started in this space, again, I was on the buy side. And at that time, buyers of dental practices were typically other dentists. Most transactions happened, dentist to dentist. And, because of that, there wasn't a lot of sophistication relative to how you think about financial performance and presentation, how you think about deal structure, and how you even, develop a valuation. And, many valuations, probably up until even 2010, from your traditional broker were framed as a percentage of collections. And as I've said for many, many years, percentage of collections is not a valuation methodology. It is a reference point. And, so again, when I started into the space, that was the start of having a more sophisticated buyer. And those more sophisticated buyers were taking a true investment perspective on the value of a business. And what today is now commonplace, meaning valuing a dental practice off of a multiple of its EBITDA. Back then, that was, EBITDA. A dentist wouldn't have any frame of reference as to what that was even referring to, let alone that it was a financial term. And so we've had a pretty big evolution. And certainly over the years, we've had sort of, I would say, escalations in the complication and sophistication, not only of who buyers are, but their deal structures, and then other sort of macroeconomic factors that have impacted, not only valuation, but, how deals are structured and consummated. And I think that dental in particular was really heating up, say, starting in 2012. And it seems to me that many people saw an opportunity in that their belief was that being a transaction advisor is simply matching a buyer and a seller. And as I'm sure having, sat and advised companies doing acquisitions, it's much more complicated than that. And, the introduction of buyer and seller is just the very, very first step. And even that, I think, is an area that many people sort of, I don't want to say disregard, but don't often spend enough time with their client to truly understand what they're trying to accomplish via a transaction, to then be able to put them in front of those partners, buyers, investors that are going to be best suited to help them achieve what they're looking to do. So, that's the first step of it. The second piece of it is, again, the valuation methodology. I can't tell you, how many brokers that I've reviewed valuation reports, offering materials, and it's very clear to me that someone showed them 3 different ways to value a business. They just plug and play. They typically don't have any deep financial training or experience. They certainly haven't been formally trained in business valuation. And, therefore, I think the result can be very misleading to the clients that they ultimately are working with. And then the next biggest step is, especially in today's marketplace, in the last, say, 5 to 7 years, we've seen a big shift away from cash at closing to, in some cases, some very significant equity roles. And, as those come with, different terms and conditions. Every private equity firm, every DSO has their own, flavor of how they structure their equity, how they value it, the terms and conditions, the restrictions on it. And, I think that there are just many in the space today that don't have the experience or the knowledge base to truly advise a seller on, if they're presented with several different offers, how to really understand which is the least risky, the most favorable, and going to achieve what they're trying to achieve. Today, as I'm sure you've seen too, there's how many people are brokers that used to be, dental sales reps, former, banking reps. It's so,
that's what I was
again, back to
my
my earlier comment of,
Yeah, just you're talking about this in the
Go
context
ahead.
of you're talking about this in the context of there are a lot of people that maybe are trying to be advisors on this in some type of a sale process or transaction process. How do we spot the ones who know what they're doing and the ones who aren't? Because that's the biggest trick. If I'm a dentist, how do I know if I'm hiring the right investment banker or the right intermediary to help me with my process? Because for some of them, they've never been through a process, and this will be sell transaction that's going to happen is possibly their one opportunity to monetize on this business that they've worked sometimes decades and decades to build, and to generate very significant wealth and value potentially. So how do they make the right decision on an advisor?
Well, one, I think it's, talking to others that have been through it, talking to
Mm.
other advisors of theirs, if they have an attorney that they trust, a CPA that they trust, asking for references. And then I think it's pretty simple. It comes down to looking at someone's actual experience to understand, do they really have the sophistication to walk me through what is most likely going to be probably the most significant economic event in my life, not to mention impacts it may have for my career, my retirement, and my personal life as well. So, I think that's the base level. I think after that, there's certain questions you can ask. I know many advisors that they have a very limited pool of buyers that they reach out to just because, they don't have the experience, they don't have the industry depth, and they certainly, again, don't have the sophistication to understand in particular the family office world and the private equity world, and how do you put yourself in front of the right parties, again, to make sure your client is going to have the best outcome overall. So, an easy question is, what's the size of your buyer pool? If someone says 25 to 50, well, that's fine. But if somebody says, I can reach out to easily 2,500, potential buyers. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to do that. But, as a firm, we have a very deep database. We spend a lot of time doing research on who these buyers are. We've been in the space for a long time, so we know most of the operators in the space, and we know most of the private equity firms that are backing them. And, we know the inside scoop on how have those businesses performed and how have those private equity firms performed over their history to, again, be able to pull back the curtain for our clients. And I think, unfortunately, many just don't have that knowledge base to be able to do that.
Interesting. So what would you say are the top 3 mistakes then that somebody who's looking to transact with their business, what would you say are the top 2 or 3 mistakes that you've seen people make in the past? And if you could then flip it to the other side and explain then what they should have done in place of.
Well, the first, I think, is those that think they can do it themselves and will entertain direct solicitation. So because the market is so competitive and has been so competitive for many years, most buyers are smart enough to know there's a lot of data in the marketplace. People certainly talk in the marketplace. And, if I really want to attract you to my organization and ideally prevent you from taking your sale to market, which is going to create more competition for me, I'm going to put an offer in front of you that's pretty good economically. And I think that, that is also a big mistake that sellers often make, is they just focus on one number, whether it's the overall valuation number or the multiple that is going to be applied to their EBITDA to determine what is the final closing price is going to be. And, as you and I have talked about many times in the past, the multiple is one number and one side of an equation, and the EBITDA figure is the other side of that equation. And there's many different ways to calculate EBITDA. A quick example is, I have a client, there is no exaggeration here. I can truly tell you that I can frame that as a transaction that was sold at 28x, 15x, and 8.5x. So those are a pretty wide range of multiples, but they're also being applied to a wide range of EBITDA figures, and simply it was historical, unadjusted, historical, adjusted, and then projected. So the math was all the same, but it's a matter of understanding both sides of that equation and understanding that when you hear data in the marketplace, you probably, if someone tells you I sold for 10 times, well, 10 times what? 10 times $1 or 10 times $10. So that's a nuance that gets missed. I think the other issue with a direct solicitation and representing yourself is you're only likely going to go through this one time. And so how do you truly know what the valuation market is? How do you truly know what appropriate deal terms and deal structures are for a deal of your size? And if you only talk to one party, you're only talking to one party and you're only getting one example, one person's perspective on value, one person's perspective on deal structure, and you really limit yourself in that regard. You're not allowing yourself to see truly what's out there and what the different options that you might have. So all that to say, I think it's, I know it sounds self-serving, but I think it's really important, for you to engage someone that does this day in, day out. The other aspect of it is, we come to the table without emotion. For most of our clients, they're the founders of their businesses. You've made a lot of sacrifice. You've put blood, sweat, and tears into building this, and there's naturally a lot of emotion there. And when you start to get into negotiating, emotion can get in the way. I've seen it probably on almost every deal and that I've worked on. And again, we can bring that neutral, logical perspective to the table to make sure that we accomplish, what you're looking to accomplish.
Nice. All right. One of the questions to throw out here as you're going, because everybody always wants to know, so what's happening in the market, and is right now a good time? Is it a bad time? How do you think about that?
Yeah, we don't think about the market that way. I mean, it's just like the stock market in a way. I mean, you can never time the stock market. Most of us, if you're going to be successful in the stock market, you have to look at the long term and make decisions that way. From our perspective, especially as it relates to healthcare in particular, I mean, there still is a very significant interest for investors to get into the space. And so that means there's a lot of capital to be deployed. And so, regardless of what's happening, in our industry or at a macroeconomic level, if you have an A+ asset, if you've built your business to be a long-term business to last into perpetuity, if you've got a good, executive team, if you've shown good growth, if you've got a pipeline for future growth, this is an A+ asset and it will always be valued appropriately. And so, we typically say to our clients, don't so much think about, is it the right time in the market as is it the right time for me?
Right.
A lot of business owners wait too long, and then that typically has some negative impacts to valuation, deal structure, and their ultimate exit of the business.
Like, that's really, really great sound advice, that instead of trying to time the market, rather if you just time yourself, meaning when is it the best time for you to move forward? Everyone's afraid of getting taken advantage of or not getting as much as they could, and, so on and so forth. But I think that's wise counsel. All right. Well, we're getting close to wrapping up here, Maria. Is there any final thoughts that you have before we wrap up this episode?
No, just again, thanks for having me. I always enjoy our conversations. And again, I just would caution people to don't take everything you hear as gospel. Be judicious, do your homework, do your research, make sure you have good advisors surrounding you, and don't be afraid to be honest about what you're looking for. It's really important to set expectations clearly and appropriately upfront. And if you do that, you're in a much better position to make sure that your deal's going to move along smoothly and you're going to be in the best position to achieve and everything that you're looking to do.
That's awesome. Well, that's it for today's episode of the Dental Truth Project. Thanks again to Maria Melone for joining us and sharing all of her background and experience and so many great nuggets of wisdom today. If you've enjoyed the episode, be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We generally are dropping one episode every Wednesday. I'm Ken Kaufman, and until next time, keep seeking the truth that helps dentistry thrive.